would therefore expect a multitude of strategies to evolve, right? So one of such well-studied or widespread form of strategy, as we all know, is camouflage, wherein prey animal have coloration or color patterns which by which they prevent themselves from getting identified or recognized by the predators. For example, in your right, there's actually a lizard trying to hide itself away from a predator by having coloration as part of their surrounding backgrounds through a strategy called background matching. And I'm sure that even after looking at this image for a very long time, you might find it very difficult to locate where the lizard is. And here is the lizard if you're still struggling to find it. And strategies like this called background matching is not only widespread in animals, but recently it has also been shown that plants also employ such strategy. For example, here in this case, by doing so, these plants avoid them getting eaten away by herbivores. Although camouflage or background matching strategies seems an intuitive and simplest means by which a prey animal can avoid getting eaten away by predators, camouflage coloration may not be effective always. And in one such situation where camouflage doesn't work is when the animal starts moving. So this limitation has been well recognized again a century ago by this famous naturalist called Hugh Cott. In his classical work, he wrote as this: "The importance of stillness as an aid to concealment can hardly be overestimated. Once movement occurs, the best cryptic device tend to become ineffectual." So in order to further illustrate the limitation of this camouflage, I'll just show you an example. So imagine this pixelated background is where the animal is trying to have background matching. So if you were to imagine, a better strategy is just to have a random sample of this particular background. So therefore, if the small square were to be the animal, you would expect it to have a similar pixelated background. So once I move this small square inside this large one, it becomes very difficult for you to locate actually where I placed it, right? But then once this the square, when I start moving the square, you can actually figure out the actual outline of the square. So this sort of therefore illustrates that this motion actually breaks camouflage, and maybe that camouflage may not be effective once the animal starts moving. So in order to further illustrate this, how widespread this problem is, I'll probably show you again a video clip from the movie Infinity Wars. Yeah.
Dude, how long have you been standing there? An hour. An hour?
Are you serious?
I've mastered the ability of standing so incredibly still that I've become invisible to the eye. Watch. You're eating a Zarknut. But my movement was so slow that it's imperceptible. I'm sure I'm at this.
Hi, Drax.
Yeah, at least by now, I hope I convinced most of you that how widespread and the limitation of camouflage is. So that actually brings us to the question of how can animals avoid predation when they actually move. Again, the solution to this problem has been proposed a while ago by again a naturalist in the early 19th century, what's called Abbot Henderson Thayer. He got inspired by coloration found in real animals, for example, like zebras, and he proposed that these high contrast patterns like bands, stripes, and zigzag can probably prevent accurate estimation of speed or direction of movement by the prey, by the predator, and therefore when the predator is trying to attack a moving animal, or the prey animal which is having these stripe patterns, may find it very difficult to catch it, because these high contrast patterns may probably creating some visual illusion such a way that it prevents the accurate estimation of the speed or direction of movement. And interestingly, many lizards from a variety of different families, as you can see here, have this high contrast stripe patterns, which obviously makes them easily detectable by the predator, can probably work based on similar principles of motion dazzle hypothesis. But then this question has never been addressed in lizards, unlike as that of zebra. So I set out to understand the question of why these whether stripes in lizard could probably work based on this motion dazzle hypothesis. So one of the very interesting thing about lizard is also that they have their ability to lose their tail through a process called caudal autotomy. For example, in this picture here, you can see that the lizard has lost its tail, probably because being attacked by a predator. And interestingly, recent research has also shown that the predators does not fall for this trick by basically attacking the most important body part, for example, the head of the body, so that the predator can actually grab the prey animal. And therefore, it is advantageous from the prey's perspective, in this case, the lizard, to have some strategy which makes them, which increases the attacks to the rear end. So putting all this piece of information together, I came up with a hypothesis that having stripes on the body or the head of the lizard can actually create this visual illusion based on this motionless hypothesis, which prevents actually when attacked by a predator, prevents accurate estimation of where the moving lizard is, and therefore when the predator was trying to catch the lizard, it would probably end up catching the tail part and not the body part, simply because having these stripes creates this visual illusion motion, which prevents the predator from accurately catching the lizard. So I set out to test this hypothesis. I tried out testing this hypothesis using real predators and using a touchscreen setup, what's called the virtual predation experiment. But then I could not successfully train these animals, for example, bird, to attack a moving object. And also because there is this ethical concern about conducting experiments with real animals, I went on to test this hypothesis using what's called the virtual predation experiment using humans, where I used humans as surrogate predators to attack a moving object on a computer screen, and then I quantified the effectiveness of stripes in reducing capture access, which I'll explain in the next slides. So I did a bunch of experiments. I'll just show you one of it today. In all my experiments, I had human participants attacking a moving object on a computer screen, on a touch screen. So in these experiments, I had rectangular object mimicking the shape of the lizard. I had a pair of them always in each experiment. In these rectangles, I had either rectangles having blotch pattern or one with the stripes, but both of these patterns are actually located only at the front end of the object as found in the real animals. And basically, I told participant to attack the front end of the object because I know that in a natural situation, predators target for the head of the body to prevent the lizards from detaching their tail and escape. And this is a small video showing how the actual setup looked. Here, you can see that the object moved in a random orientation. And basically, I just told them to attack basically the part containing the stripes or the one with blotch pattern. So as a measure of predation, I just counted the number of attacks that went to the different parts of the rectangle, basically either the front half or the rear half, which doesn't have any patterns. So here the prediction is that because I told people to attack the front half, you would expect more number of attacks to land at the front because they were told to attack the front half for the one with blotch pattern. But then for the one with stripe, you would expect if it were to work based on this motion as a hypothesis, so you would expect a lower number of attacks to be directed at the front end than at the rear, simply because people might find it difficult to catch the part containing the stripes, right? So these are the results. Here I'll show you on the y-axis the number of attacks that went to the front by the rear half as a proportion, and on the x-axis I show the object type, which is either blotched or the one with stripes. And here, as you can see, this proportion was much more higher than 1 for the one with blotched pattern, whereas for the one with stripes, you see that this proportion was much more lower than 1. So which sort of indicates that people were successful in attacking the front end of these object containing the blotched pattern. And therefore, consequently, the number of attacks that went to the rear end was much more lower. Whereas for the one with stripes, you can see the number of, because this proportion is lower, this sort of suggests that the number of attacks that went to the front was much more lower than the one that went to the rear. In other words, that the number of attacks that the people were targeting towards this object was much more higher towards the rear end. So this sort of suggests that people were actually finding it very difficult to attack the object containing stripes, and therefore suggests that these stripes might actually work by redirecting attacks to the rear end. And in real life situation, this could probably indicate that lizards having stripes in the front end or the body can actually create this visual illusion based on this motion diurnal hypothesis, and therefore can end up increasing the attack the rear end of the lizard, which is basically the tail, which they can drop and escape when attacked by a predator. So having found that yes, stripes might work by increasing the attack at the rear end, then I went on to understand how these stripes might probably work. So initially, when Abbott Thayer proposed this hypothesis about motion dazzle, he suggested that these stripes might work by affecting perceived speed. In this case, for lizard, if it were to increase the number of attacks to the rear end, you would expect, you can probably think of 3 different scenarios of how the perceived speed could actually be manipulated by these stripe patterns. So in order to illustrate this, imagine a predator is trying to attack a moving lizard again, and you can have 3 different possible scenarios. One is that the perceived speed, it's the speed at which the predator perceived to move the striped lizard to be either faster or the same as the actual speed of the moving lizard, or the speed which is much more slower than in reality. And depending on these 3 different scenarios, you would expect the attacks where the attacks where the predator targets to vary also in real life situation. So if the predator were to perceive to move the striped lizard much more faster than in reality, you would probably calculate the lizard to be much more far ahead of the actual position where the lizard is, and therefore, if the striped patterns are perceived to move faster, you would expect more number of attacks to land at the front end of the moving lizard. In other situation where the perceived speed to be same as the actual speed, you would expect the predatory attack to land in a position where it's actually aimed, right? Because the perceived speed is same as the actual speed of the lizard. Whereas on the other hand, if the perceived speed is much more slower than the actual speed of the lizard, you would expect the number of attacks to be landing at the rear end, simply because in reality, the lizard would have moved much more farther ahead of where they are perceived to be, simply because these stripes create visual illusion, which makes the lizard to be perceived to be much more slower than their actual speed of movement. So therefore, here the prediction is that these targets with stripes are perceived to move much more slower than in reality for redirecting the attacks. So I set out to test this question by adopting a procedure from a psychophysical experiment, again using humans, what's called the adaptive staircase paradigm. So I'll not get into the details of this procedure because it's quite complex, but I'll just explain in simple words what I did. So I just showed people 2 objects, one with having stripes and one with blotch pattern, one after the other. And then I fixed the speed of one of the object, in this case, for example, the one with blotch pattern. And then I asked people the question of which of these 2 objects is perceived to move faster. And based on the response that I got from the people, in the next time I increased or decreased the speed of the one having stripe patterns until the situation where people say yes, at the current speed of these 2 objects, I perceive them to move at the equal speed. So by doing so, I can obtain what's called the matched speed. By comparing the matched speed, I know the speed at which the people actually perceive the striped object to move at the equal speed as that of the blotched one. So I can understand if this speed were to be higher, then I can higher or lower. I can say whether how much deviation is there from the actual speed of the striped object when compared to the one with blotched patterns. So here are the results. I found that this matched speed, the matched speed, that is the speed at which the people say yes, both these stripes and blotch patterns people were actually increasing the speed of the stripe pattern despite that these two objects were moving at the equal speed, they were increasing the speed of these stripe patterns to say, yes, now I perceive that both of them are moving at the equal speed. So which sort of suggests that people actually perceive in reality the object containing stripe to be moving much more slower than they actually are, and henceforth they're actually trying to increase the speed of these object containing stripe to say, yes, these two objects are moving at the equal speed. So this sort of suggests that these stripe targets are actually perceived to move slower than the blotch targets, and therefore can explain why people were actually, in my previous experiment, were finding it difficult to attack the front end of the object. Simply because they perceived these striped object to move slower, they were very less accurate in actually judging the actual position of the object at the speed at which it's moving, and therefore ended up catching the rear end of the rectangular object than the one at the front. So having found that the mechanism and the function of these stripes, then I went on to understand what are the factors that could probably affect the evolution of stripes in the real lizards. One of the patterns that I came across in the literature is that many lizards have these striped patterns only when they are juvenile, but then when they grow up, they tend to lose both these stripes and the colorful tail. Another interesting study, I've also found that in Japan, in islands surrounding Japan, mainland Japan, that many of these juvenile lizards, when they hatch out of the egg, also seem to vary in their body coloration and their body size based on the extent of predation pressure. For example, when in islands containing both birds and snakes, the study has found that the lizard tend to be much more smaller in size, and they also have stripes. Whereas in islands without the snakes, they found that these hatching lizards are much more larger in size. They also doesn't have stripes. So this sort of suggests that the functioning of stripes is linked to predation, obviously. And also, interestingly, it shows that the function of stripes is somehow linked to body size, because independently, in many across either at the individual level in the population or within the same individual, when they grow up, they tend to lose their stripes based on their body size. So this sort of suggests, then I went on, this sort of proposes a question of whether the function of these stripe patterns are actually linked to body size. So I explored the function of body size using a two different approach. The first one, I conducted what's called a comparative phylogenetic analysis, where I basically looked for association between presence or absence of stripes with the body size of the lizard. So for this, I quantified coloration data for around 1,600 species of individuals found all across the globe by using images from trustable sources for each individual species. And then I basically I coded the coloration data as a binary trait, where I coded presence of stripes, horizontal stripes as presence, whereas presence of many other coloration, for example, without any body pattern, or one with vertical stripes, or one with other blotch coloration, to be absence of stripes. And then I collected the data for body size as two different measure. One is the snout to vent length, which is basically the length of the lizard from tip of the snout to the vent. And another body size measure, I collected body width data, which is basically the width of the body in lizards. So then I conducted this, what's called the phylogenetic comparative analysis, to look for association between if the stripes are correlated to the body size of these lizard across species. And here are the results. I show the snout to vent length on the y-axis, which is basically the length of the lizard, and whether a presence or absence of stripes on the x-axis. Here you can see the snout to vent length is much more higher for the lizard without the horizontal stripes, whereas the one with the horizontal stripes, you can see that the body length, or the snout to vent length, is much more shorter. So this sort of suggests that the evolution of stripes is actually favored in shorter lizard species, and therefore extends what's being found in the intraspecific level, that is when the association between loss of stripe coloration when the lizard age. that this somehow that these functioning of these stripes could be linked to body size of the lizards, which I'll get to it in the next subsequent slides. However, when I looked at correlation between stripes and body width, I did not find any correlation. Here I show a body width, which is actually again corrected for length of the lizard. I did not actually find any difference between the lizard species having stripes or no stripes. So this sort of suggests that with the evolution of stripes is not being affected by body width of the lizard, and indirectly sort of hints at that somehow the effect produced by these stripes is actually parallel to the direction of the movement of the lizards. So in order to understand why actually these stripes might be correlated to the function to the body size, I again went on to the literature and I came up with a bunch of hypotheses, and one of it is that I found in bigger animals, it's actually easier for the predator to attack than the smaller ones. In order to illustrate this, I'll just show you an example from cartoon. So imagine here, Tom trying to attack Jerry. You can see that despite after multiple attempts, Tom fails to attack it. Whereas on the other hand, here again, you can see Jerry find it very easier to attack Tom. So this is simply because as the effective area of the animal increases, it's become easier for the predator to attack the object. Simply because the area is huge, they can easily catch or attack the object. And therefore, this sort of suggests that probably the efficacy of these stripe patterns decreases as the length increases, simply because as the object or the lizard becomes larger and larger, it becomes very difficult for becomes much more easier for the predator to attack the object. So in order to test this idea, again, I conducted a virtual predation experiment where I basically had a similar pattern as in my previous experiment. But then I only manipulated the target size, where I basically had either a rectangular object or the one with, as in the squares. So I had object of size 1 × 2 centimeter, 1 × 4 centimeter, and 2 × 2 centimeter. So which is by basically comparing the object which is much more longer, say for example 1 × 2 centimeter, than the object which much more shorter. For example, in this case, 2 × 2 centimeter, I can say how the effect of length actually affect the effectiveness of these stripes. And again, by comparing the 1 × 2 centimeter object with that of 2 × 2 centimeter, I can understand how these the width of the object actually affect the functioning of stripes. So here are the results. Again, I'll show you the total number of attacks on the y-axis to be much more easier to understand, and also the size of these objects along the x-axis. So here you can see I've arranged them based on the length, and you can I then again compare the total number of attacks between the object containing blotched or the one with stripes. And it's quite clear that you can see that these differences, that in most of these situations, you can see that object of much more of shorter in length, containing stripes are captured much more lower than the one with blotch pattern. However, as the length increases, for example, in this case, the one object containing 1 × 4 centimeters, there was no difference between in the total number of attacks that the people were directing against for the one with blotch or the one with stripes. So in order to understand this much more easier, I'll just plot these slope values from these comparisons. And here I'll put them in the y-axis, the estimated slopes. And as you can see here, the objects of size 1 × 2 and 2 × 2 were equally effective in lowering the total number of attacks when compared to the one with blotch pattern. So this sort of suggests that there is no effect of target width, in the sense that stripes were equally effective irrespective of the change in the width of this object. However, as the length increases, you can see this difference between the one with blotch pattern and one with stripes to be much more lower. So this sort of suggests that the effect of these stripes in lowering the attacks when compared to the blotch pattern sort of decreases as the length of the object increases. which sort of goes well with the pattern that I found in my comparative analysis, and sort of suggests that again that the error produced by these stripes are actually along the axis parallel to the prey trajectory. And overall, these experiments and the comparative analysis sort of indicates that these stripes can probably are not advantageous in lizards of larger size, simply because the predator might probably find it easier to attack the object containing or the prey having stripes of larger size easier, because the overall the area of the prey increases. It's easier for the predator to attack them. So moving on, because I know that these stripes could work by probably redirecting attacks to the rear end, I went on to conduct a bunch of other analysis where I basically look for correlation between these presence of stripes and bunch of other traits that are found in actual animals that I collected across many bunch of species, which I could potentially link them to the functioning of stripes with that of the motion dazzle hypothesis, so that I can have some evidence of saying yes, probably that these stripes might actually work based on this action mechanism that I'm proposing. So for this, I collected look for correlation between various other traits, which I was basically trying to link these stripe coloration in many different species with that of the rapid escape, caudal autotomy, that is the ability to lose their tail, and diurnal activity, and so on, which I'll explain in the subsequent slides. So as in my previous study, here I again used the data that I collected from my previous study to understand the coloration lizard. Basically, I just coded coloration as in the patterns as the presence or absence of stripes, which is basically presence or absence of horizontal stripes. And for data on other traits, I just collected from literature, from various field guides, and from published literature, so I can link these traits with these stripes. So with the first state of hypothesis, I looked for these correlation of the stripe evolution with that of the caudal autotomy, which is basically the ability of lizard to lose their tail or not. Because I hypothesized that the stripe might redirect attacks to the rear end during motion. If it were to function in the lizard losing their tail when once attacked by the predator, you would expect these stripes to be correlated with that of the ability for the lizard to lose their tail, right? Because stripes may not be effective if you might probably be useless if the lizards had stripes, but then they cannot lose their tail when attacked by predator, simply because when attacked the predator can easily grab the lizard and escape. So for this, again, I collected data on the ability of the lizard species to lose their tail or not, and then I looked for association of that ability with that of the presence or absence of stripes. And here I show the proportion of species containing stripes or no stripes along the y-axis, and the ability of the lizard to lose their tail on the x-axis. Here you can see there's more number of species that have stripes also have the ability to lose their tail, whereas for the one which doesn't have have stripes along their body also doesn't have the ability to lose their tail. So which sort of suggests that the functioning of these stripe coloration could probably be linked to the functioning of to the evolution of caudal autotomy, which basically suggests that this stripe could probably work, or functioning of these stripes is actually linked to the ability of the lizard losing the tail or not, which sort of goes with the hypothesis, that the stripe can probably indeed increase the attacks to the rear end so that the lizard can drop its tail and escape. So then I went on to test another hypothesis where I looked for correlation between evolution of stripes and diurnal activity pattern. Here, because we know that these stripes work by creating visual illusion in lizard, you would expect stripes to work better against visual predators which are active during the daytime. And therefore, you would expect a correlation of these stripes with that of the diurnal activity, which is basically lizards being active during the daytime. So that's exactly what I tested in this set of hypotheses, that whether these evolution of stripes is correlated to whether the lizard being active during the daytime, which is basically diurnal, or lizard being active during the nighttime, which is actually called nocturnal. Same as in the previous graph, here I represent the proportion of a species on the y-axis. Here you can see there is more number of lizard species having stripes or also active during daytime than lizards which doesn't have stripes, which are basically active during the daytime. So which sort of hints at the point that lizards which have stripes are actually quite active during the daytime, so that they can probably because these stripes are works better when against visual predators which are actually effective or active during the daytime and not during the night. So then I went on to look at a bunch of other couple of traits which are actually associated with rapid escape and movement. So we know that from previous studies that rapid escape from predator is difficult in scansorial habitat, which is basically arboreal or rock dwelling habitat. Here in this picture, a famous movie from the recent BBC Planet Earth documentary, you can see that the lizard being chased away by the predators. You can imagine that it's much more easier for the lizard to be actually in constant motion and employ a rapid escape strategy when they're actually on the ground or a more terrestrial habitat than lizards which are associated more with arboreal or rock dwelling habitat, where they cannot employ a rapid escape or running away from predator as an effective strategy. Or in other words, you would expect lizards to be in constant motion when they're actually escaping a predator, when they're actually terrestrial, rather the one that are preferred to stay on either arboreal or rock dwelling habitat. Henceforth, I came up with the prediction that these evolution of these stripe patterns to be correlated with the habitat in which the preferred habitat in which the lizard lives, which is basically that these stripes to be associated with ground dwelling species than the stripeless species in these lizards. So as with the prediction, I found that I show you here the proportion of species that having stripes or no stripes, and along the x-axis I showed that either the lizards are either ground dwelling or scansorial, which is basically arboreal or rock dwelling. So here you can see that the more number of lizards having stripes are also much more ground dwelling, whereas for the one without stripes tend to be more associated with arboreal or rock dwelling habitat, which probably sort of indicates that the effectiveness of these stripes could actually be linked to the lizards tend to prefer the habitat where the lizard lives, which sort of suggests that these indirectly hints at the point that these stripes could probably be associated with strategies which are associated with rapid escape than being sit and wait sort of strategy. So in order to understand this association much more better, I then look for correlation of these stripes with mobility of the lizards. So we know that from previous studies that these stripes work better at high speed, meaning stripes are effective in reducing the capture success by predators when they're moving at high speed. And therefore, you would expect a correlation between these evolution of stripe coloration in lizard species, which can move much more faster or at higher speed. However, I could not collect the sprint speed data for many different species. But then we know that from previous studies that because lizards being ectothermic, meaning these lizards are dependent on the external environment to regulate their body temperature, the sprint speed at which the lizard moves, or the speed at which the lizard moves, it's actually being strongly correlated with body temperature. So therefore, I used body temperature as a proxy for the sprint speed to look for association between a sprint speed and the presence or absence of stripes. So here I show the presence or absence of stripes along the x-axis and the body temperature of these lizards, which are active during which are actually active, collected during when they are active. And here you can see that lizards having stripes seem to have a higher body temperature than the lizard without stripes. So this sort of suggests that lizards having stripes are much more could probably have can move at higher speed simply because they have a higher body temperature, and this sort of suggests the point that these effectiveness of stripes could probably be better when they're actually moving around in the environment than when they are actually not active. And it's sort of been indirectly shown by this correlation between body temperature and presence or absence of stripes. So this bunch of analysis sort of suggests that indeed stripes in lizard could probably be correlated with traits which with mobility or rapid escape, and therefore hints at the point that these stripes could probably be effective when the lizards are actually moving than when they're actually not, and suggests that indeed motion dazzle patterns in lizard provide some evidence for motion dazzle hypothesis. So with that, I'd like to summarize my talk. Because we know that because motion breaks camouflage, stripes seem to be a better alternative form of defense for many animals to have in motion to avoid predation when they're moving in their actual environment. And in the special case in lizards, it seems that these stripes could probably work by increasing the attack to the rear end, and they do so by lowering the perceived speed of the, that is the speed at which the predator perceives the moving lizard have containing stripes. And finally, because I found the correlation of these stripe coloration with traits associated with the mobility, so it provides some evidence that in real life situation, probably species containing stripes are having a strategy, escape strategy, or the movement patterns linked with high mobility, and therefore suggests that these stripes might function actually during the movement in these lizards. Although I found in my experiment that these stripes patterns can prevent attack by predators when they move, more number of studies is actually needed to test these sort of hypotheses in real animals, which could probably indicate that stripes may indeed work in motion. I did a couple of experiments that I looked at this set of things in real animals, but I did not present this today because of the time limitation. But I'll be happy to share if you have, if you want to know what exactly I found with real animals and a few other questions. So with that, I like to thank you all for listening to my talk, and I also like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Ulasa, and also my collaborator, Dr. Sami Marilaita, for helping me during various stages during the study. Thank you very much, and if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gopal. It was a really wonderful session. Okay, now we can go over for question and answer session. So I request participants to unmute yourself, or you can put your questions and queries in the chat box.
Hi, so I have three questions. The first one is that the most of the experiment you performed, like the virtual experiment, I think you have done those in a plain background, right? The colored plain background.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but in the real situation in nature, so there will be a great deal of effect from the background. So, how that background will affect the involvement of the stripes in preventing predation?
Yeah, so it's a very nice question. Yes, it could depend on the context at which the animal is viewed. For example, there is a recent study which has shown that the environment which had much more complex patterns, which actually makes a predator to be less successful in catching the moving object. And henceforth, I would expect the environment which has much more complex patterns to make these effectiveness of stripes to be much more higher. But then to be much more conservative, I just chose the background containing plain without any patterns, so that I can test it in the least possible way how effective these stripes were. But then indeed, it's true that in nature, in a much more complex scenario, you would expect things to vary. And the point is that in much more complex environment, you would expect a stripe to probably work better than in, for example, plain backgrounds. Yeah.
But in nature, there will be also the another dimension, the third dimension of per se depth and
3D.
all.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that may
yeah.
decrease the effect of
Indeed.
stripe.
Yes, so it's also true that there have been a couple of studies which have shown that having these stripes affect the way you perceive the three-dimensional position, the depth of field. For example, you know that because that these stripes also affect the perceived size of the object. These stripes could actually make the object to actually perceive to be much more smaller or larger than what's there in reality. And because we know this depth perception of any object is actually linked to the size of the object, it could probably also mess up in the way by which we perceive the depth. And therefore, stripe could probably be much more effective in a three-dimensional perspective. So, but then because I could not test this using in a 3D setup, I just went in a conservative way again to do it in a 2D manner. Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
and
three dimensional
yeah,
could
and
also be. Yeah.
yeah, my last question is that in one of the slide you show that when there were both birds and snakes, there were stripes, but when there were only birds, there were no
Yeah,
stripes. So that means
yeah,
predation by snake has been linked to the existence of stripe. But
exactly.
how like the birds when they predator do predation from the air and attack
Different
from
angle. Yeah,
the
yeah,
top,
definitely.
they can be more embezzled by the stripe. But snake coming from the backside, how will they be embezzled by the stripes?
Exactly. That's a very good question. So in one of the studies that actually I explored for correlation between stripes and the coloration of the tail, I found out that these stripes, which are actually present on the top of this lizard, to be correlated with red tail coloration, and the one having stripes on the sides. For example, in this picture you see here, this species of lizard doesn't have stripes on the top, are to be in many of the species to be correlated with blue tail color. So which sort of indicates that this because you know that the predators perceive these colors differently, so stripes could probably be effective. Having stripes along the sides of the lizard, which makes sense for animals, for example, like snakes, which perceive the lizard from much more side than the, for example, the birds, which perceive the moving the prey from the top to be much more effective. So it is very much true that this location of stripes could actually be associated with the actual predators of the real lizards. And my analysis, which I did not show, hints at the point that you mentioned that the stripes along the side of the lizard could probably be linked to animals which are attacking from the side, for example, snakes or mammals. And the stripes which are present on the top could be related to the predator, for example, birds, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Gopal?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ranjit here.
Mhm.
So the phylogenetic things,
Mhm.
did you see what is the pattern of losing this tail, sorry, losing this pattern and then gaining this pattern? Has it evolved multiple times or is it single
Yeah,
event?
yeah, yeah, it has evolved multiple times. Yes, indeed. So because these tribe patterns are found in many different families, I found them to have evolved many different times. Indeed, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
every time when you
Mhm.
compare the size and their diurnal activity or the ability to lose the tail or
Mhm.
the habitat they actually reside,
Mhm.
so do you see a particular pattern in let's say in some groups where some groups of lizard who has the pattern but they are more day active, but in some other group it is day inactive. What I want to say, even
Mhm.
within the striped pattern, the species with striped pattern, whether the
Mhm.
day active or inactive is separated.
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
it always club together?
Yeah, so whatever I shown, I did it separately for now, but then I had the global analysis where I included everything. So it seems that there is this multiple suite of traits are correlated. For example, the one having stripes also are having the ability to lose their tail, and they're also are active in the daytime, and therefore are having higher body temperature. So therefore, it sort of indicates that there is a suite of functional traits, I would say, that are quite correlated with each other, which is probably suggests that maybe because the functioning of stripes are effective only at that particular context, because these lizards have that particular suite of traits.
Right, right. Because why I was asking, because even within, if you see the striped individuals, striped species,
Yeah.
even within that you see quite, even though it is correlating that maximum number of those species have, let's say, day active, but you still have a quite a good proportion of species which are day inactive, right? Which are probably
Day
nocturnal,
night. Yes,
if
yes,
I am
exactly.
not wrong,
It's a very good point.
right?
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So
So that's a pattern you see in all other traits, like losing ability to lose the trait or the niche which they reside.
yeah, yeah,
So I was trying to understand what actually, how does this
yeah.
individual still have some
So it,
advantage?
so it is also possible that these stripes doesn't have a single function. For example, we know that these stripes could also actually can also work in against predation in another context via something called a disruptive coloration, wherein having these stripes prevents the predator from actually perceiving the actual outline of the animal, and therefore it makes it difficult for the predator to spot these lizards with stripes. Uh, so therefore, in this case, you would expect them to be associated with diurnal activity simply because nocturnal activity simply because it doesn't make sense. It's already quite well established that many of these animals which employ camouflage coloration are seen to be much more active during the daytime, and therefore have camouflage for camouflage well during the daytime so that they don't get spotted by the predator during daytime. Yeah. For example, in this case of geckos, they could probably these tribes could probably work and as a camouflage strategy rather than as a motion as I propose. Yeah.
And what is this color of the tails you had
Yeah.
mentioned?
Yeah.
So
So color, you have many different colors in the lizard that you see. For example, here you have red, but many lizards also have blue color, and they also have green color, and they also have yellow color. So I think these colored are actually linked to how the predator actually perceive the colors. For example, we know very much that birds perceive UV light. Therefore, in community having many number of predatory birds, you would probably expect lizards to have blue colors. And likewise, based on the composition of, say, for example, we know that mammals doesn't perceive UV, and therefore, in that case, you would probably have lizards having much more red colored tail because they could probably work better against mammal and unlike birds, which perceive blue. So again, I probably did not explain the function of these colored tail. So like I hypothesized for the functioning of these tribes, the colored tail also work by deflecting the attack to the tail. So that the lizard can drop their tail and then they can escape. So the function of the tail coloration is also similar to that of having stripes on the body, simply by increasing the attack to the tail. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I think there are a few questions in the chat.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box. So Anish is asking, is there a neurological reason why pattern with stripes appear to move slowly than the original?
So the actual mechanism is quite not clear, but there have been a couple of hypotheses why these stripes might lower the perceived speed. So this is happening because what's called an aperture problem. Because we know that because we have very small visual field in our retina, the perception of motion is actually based on stitching up information from local by perceiving differences in the contrast over time locally, and then putting up the information together in the larger picture. And because we know that we have retinal fields which are much more localized, our motion is stitched together from local to the global perspective. And what happens with the stripes is that it messes up with this process, and therefore we actually don't perceive the true direction or the speed at which the object containing stripes are moving. So yeah, that could probably be one of the explanation of mechanistically how these neurologically how stripes are messing up with how we perceive the speed or the direction of movement. Yeah.
So there is one more question from
Good.
Subhasis. It's saying, is there sexual dimorphism in stripes?
Yes, yes. There is very much sexual dimorphism. In the current study where I looked for correlation between presence of stripes and the very many different traits, I actually did not consider species showing sexual dimorphism. But then I'll just show you an example from a study that I conducted again in ICER. So we have a species of lizard called skink called Sphenomorphus, dussumieri skink in Western Ghats, which actually sort of show sexual dimorphism. For example, here you can see females of similar size retain their stripes much more longer than males, which they tend to lose much more faster when they actually grow up. And this could probably be related to how the rate at which these lizards are growing. Because these lizards are sexually dimorphic, the males grows much more bigger than the female. And therefore, the lizards, the males, which are of same size, grows at a much more faster rate. And therefore, they lose their stripes much more early than females of similar size. But then, this could probably be linked to many different things associated with what the different sexes are actually doing in the real life. For example, unlike a female, male, we know that they actually have to establish territory, and therefore they probably are much more out always, and therefore stripes may not work when they are being out there having a larger size. But then the association between the sexual, why there's sexual dimorphism is not being explored in very fine detail. But yes, sexual dimorphism is a bit seen in many species of lizard having stripes or not. Yeah.
So that is a related question. It's from Anis. It's saying, can caudal autotomy cause disadvantage in sexual selection?
Yes, yes, very much. That is the reason. That is the reason that you find in many different lizard species to not lose their tail, because we know that many of these lizard species communicate with the females to attract females. They use these chemical signals, which are basically esters and other fatty acid based chemicals, volatile chemicals. And we know very much that these lizards tend to store all these fat and related materials in their tail. And therefore, the studies have proposed that losing tail is not good for a lizard if it were to trying to attract a mate. And so therefore it could also be, and therefore that is one of the situation by which it is possible that it's possible that these lizards are losing their stripe when they grow up, meaning it's not advantageous for the lizard to lose their trail when they are mature, because they want to probably communicate with female using chemical signals. And therefore you lose strategies, for example, stripes in this case, which actually put them not in a good situation by losing their tail when they want to retain their tail for other different purposes, for example, for attracting the female. Yes.
Yeah, so there is someone actually even in this same conversation, someone has challenged that is it possible, is it better for the lizard to have a small tail, small body size, which is easy to run away,
Yeah, so actually, I look for this association. So I look for a correlation between these body size and the tail ratio of these lizards. So because you would expect because as the question is asked, it's advantageous for the lizard to have much more shorter tail and shorter body length and a longer tail, so that they can be much more effective in increasing the attack to the tail part. So for this, I look for correlation between presence or absence of the stripe coloration with that of the body size and the tail length. So here you can see the lizards having stripes also have this higher amount of this ratio, which sort of suggests that having many of these lizards which have these stripes tend to be much more shorter in length, but then they have much more longer tail length, which sort of goes again well with the hypothesis that probably having stripes in the body can work by redirecting attacks with the tail, which is makes it easier for the predator to grab the tail if it's much more longer. Yeah, this comparative analysis kind of hints at that point. Yeah.
So there is one more question. Is it that because we see the stripes on the body,
Yeah.
so is there any related trade-off of the stripes? Because they have stripes, does it has any negative effect or something?
Yeah, it is possible in terms of, for example, how conspicuous these lizards are to the predators. For example, we know that as the size of the animal increases, it becomes easier for the predator to spot it, right? So larger the lizard, it's larger than animal, easier. It becomes easier for the predator to spot them when they're looking for animals. And therefore, because these stripes are inherently conspicuous, meaning they are much more noticeable, there could be some additive effect of this body size and the stripe coloration, which sort of enhances or makes it much more easier for the lizard to get spotted. And therefore, another possibility of why many lizard doesn't have these stripes when they are bigger is also that they are probably getting spotted easily by the predators, and therefore they don't want that from happening, and therefore they are losing their stripes um, uh, when they are growing up, or for example, when they are much more larger. Yeah.
So what about, because whether these stripes exist only in juvenile or it is also found in adults? Because in somewhere you had shown that in juvenile we find the stripe
Yeah.
pattern, but not in adult.
Yeah, so there are many different species that these process happens, but in many species which are smaller tend to retain the stripes when they are adult. But then for the species which are relatively grows bigger, they tend to lose their stripes. So it's sort of a mix that,
Okay.
yeah,
Size matters. Yeah.
yeah,
In the
size
body
matters.
size.
Yeah.
So there is one question from Tanya. It says that, have you tried scenario where predator is catching the prey from head, not from tail?
Okay, sorry if I was not clear. I actually told people to exactly what you said. That I told people to the predators to catch from the head side, actually, in all of my experiments, not from the tail side. But then what I find is that when they told them to go for the head side, they ended up catching the tail side. So that's probably because these they were not accurate in catching the lizards having the pattern, the rectangles having stripes, because they perceive it to move slower, and therefore they ended up catching the tail part, right? But then
Right.
in one more experiment, what I did is that I also had changed the position of these stripes, where rather than having these stripes at the front, I made them these stripes to be present at the back. And then again, I told people to go for the front end of the object. And in this case, I did not find any difference between objects having blotch pattern and objects having stripes, which are actually present at the back, which sort of indicates that having stripes only at the front end of the object is effective in reducing the attack towards the front. Which sort of explains why lizards have stripes on the front end of the front, on the body and the head, and not in the tail part. Yeah.
Excuse me.
So
Like, I have a question regarding that experiment only. Like, in that capture experiment which you did, Like
Yeah.
what velocities were you making those like thing run?
So this velocity, it's much more arbitrary. It doesn't probably link that is found in real animals. It was around 17 centimeters per second. But then I chose this based on doing some pilot experiments, and then I figured out probably this is the condition at which these I found the effect. But I don't know how this would translate in real life situation because it's much more relative. And also the speed at which the predator is moving, and there's quite a lot of variation in nature. The speed at which lizard move because
Because
the
if it's
speed is
slower, it
yeah.
becomes easier to capture. Like, and
Yes,
if
definitely.
it's
Yes. I do
faster,
not. It's become much more difficult. Yeah. That pattern is true. Yes. So in my pilots, I found that when the lizard when the object moved at a slower speed, they were not effective at all. But then when they were moving at some higher speed relatively, they were effective. Yes.
but then if they move, like if I go further than that,
Very much
very
further, no, nothing happens. Both of them becomes equally effective
yeah,
because you
yeah,
cannot do anything at all. But then in nature, I don't know if that can actually happen because there is a physiological limit of how fast you can move, right? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you.
So, okay, so I think quite. So Anis has one more question asking that in larger individuals where stripes are often not present, what could be the anti-predatory strategy?
Other anti-predatory strategies, if larger individuals don't tend to have stripes, what might be there? Okay. So this could probably be linked to camouflage. For example, in this case of lizard you see here, they tend to don't have stripes. So, which could probably makes them much more camouflaged well with their environment, unlike having stripes, which puts them at a much higher risk of them being detected easily. So, having no stripes could probably work better as a better camouflage strategy, probably. Yeah.
Can you, Gopal, see the last question from Uttam Das? It's asking about evolutionary arms race.
Arms race. It is possible.
I'm not sure.
What exactly he means by arms race, right?
Yeah, between what actually? I am not sure, but can you
Uh,
interpret?
uh, yeah. So
I mean, it's
probably
asking, can this stripe pattern be explained in terms of evolutionary arms?
yeah. Yeah. So it could be so one of the thing is that these stripes work. The mechanism at which it works based on this motion Dazzle hypothesis, it's based on a visual illusion, as I said, as in what's called the aperture problem. So this limitation, it's basically there because of many different reasons of the physiological limit of how we perceive motion. And therefore, it seems that the coloration that are found in animals have actually exploited this limitation. But it could be possible that predators, which are much more have tackled this problem, are much more robust in catching a moving object or effective in attacking animals which are actually moving. Can maybe it doesn't fall for these tricks. It's possible that direction there is an arms race sort of situation where some predators could have actually overcome this limitation by which they don't actually fall for this trick of stripe creating this illusion when they're actually moving. So yeah, it's possible, but
Yeah,
I
so
don't know how to actually can be
that
tested.
needs, yeah, in a natural setup, you have to have
Yeah,
some information on the
yeah,
predators.
yeah.
Okay, so are there more questions?
Mhm.
Okay, then. Okay, thanks, Gopal. I think
Yeah,
no more
thank you.
questions are coming now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, so it's
Mhm.
great. It's really great to hear you,
Thank you
and
very
thank
much.
you to accept our invitation.
Yeah,
And
thank
we
you.
hope once you come to India sometime, you will visit
Mhm.
us and
Sure.
interact with your students soon.
Oh, actually, we got a couple of questions in the chat box. Quickly, if you can still 80 questions. You can see the questions.
The couple of questions that came after this, right? Around 9:38 a.m. Yeah. So don't snakes generally predate by traction movement? Presence or absence of pattern should matter more for avian predators. If so, why presence of snakes might affect? Yeah. So it's true that snakes adopt a much more settle weight strategy, but there are also many different type of snakes which are actually active during the daytime. The diurnal snake, which sort of chases the lizard. So in those situations, stripes might probably work. So in that case, I would expect stripes to be much more effective. In the example that I showed you, in the situation where the stripes are lost in species from islands in Japan, those were rat snakes, which are actually during daytime, which probably sort of adapt much more an active foraging strategy, which actually don't sit, wait for the animal to move and then attack. So it's much more context dependent. Yeah, it's true that these types might probably work on the predator, on the strategy at which the predators are employing in catching the animal, and it's probably much more effective for the one which are actually chasing them. So can perceived speed may be different from predators having monocular vision. So it could be possible that these perceived speed might be linked to how whether the predator perceive the depth of information or not. But then I have no evidence or studies which has actually tested this. But because, as I explained previously, these stripes affect the perceived size of the object, it would somehow disrupt the way in which the depth information is perceived. So therefore, I would probably expect stripes to be much more effective in species which are not are binocular vision, in the sense that they can perceive the depth information. But knowledge about this monocular vision and the perceived speed, I'm not sure about. And final question is about bright coloration in tail head distracting predator towards tail. What strategy results having bright coloration in head again method up. So the function of these bright coloration in the head is, for example, in case of agamas, it's basically to attack females. And in many of these situations, we also know these colors, bright colors in their head is not retained constantly, because we know that these bright colors attracts attention from predators. And there is actually no anti-predatory benefit of having bright colors on their head. So it serves the function of attracting females, and it's actually linked to sexual signaling and disease. Yeah, yeah, and I hope I answered questions. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah. See you sometime soon. Yeah. Bye bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Bio Club would like to convey sincere thanks to Dr. Gopal. It was really wonderful to have you here, and hope to meet you in person very soon. So that's it. Thank you everyone for joining in for this webinar session. Stay tuned with Lavida social media platforms. Next webinar will be conducted very soon. Thank you. Thank you so much.